Hi, thank you all so much for being here this evening. I want to give an extra special thank you to some folks who traveled for this evening. My sister's Tasha, who came in from Omaha, Nebraska. Um, Christy, who came in from East Glacier, Montana. Um, my in-laws drove in from St. Louis, Carrie and Sharon Mason. I have a dear friend and her family who drove in from Omaha, Margie. My gallerist David from LA, and and of course my husband Michael and son Alton. I am from Mandaree, North Dakota on the Fort Berthold Reservation. On my father's side, I am Mandan and Hidatsa, and on my mother's side, I am German American. Her family immigrated over from Russia and were farmers in North Dakota. Oops. I grew up in North Dakota, Montana, Oklahoma, and Nebraska. My father worked for the National Park Service, and as a result, I considered those places my backyard. I spent a lot of time outdoors in rich historical sites, and besides the cultural connection with land from my Mandan and Hidatsa tribes, which is a well-rounded respect for the land, seeing it as a living being, there was also the stewardship and then the growing up within the National Park Service from that end. So I credit these formative years where I spent so much time outside in lands where you get giant skies and never-ending horizons and an overwhelming feeling of vastness as shaping how I see and becoming the foundation for what I explore in my work today. In 2017, I began working with artificial turf. I was living in Beaumont, Texas at the time, where I lived for about 3 years with my husband, who's from there, and he was taking care of his grandparents. So I was wandering the aisles of Home Depot, looking for some material inspiration. There's no art stores in Beaumont, really, so I did what I could. And I came across this bright blue AstroTurf, and I was so surprised by the color and the material. It was really alien to me, especially growing up in the North. We didn't really use artificial turf. So it felt like a really blank canvas in a way. And I love that I could shape it. It could hold its own shape without really having to do a structured background, which was really important for me formally. And this was actually one of the first AstroTurf pieces that I made. This here is a detail shot, and what initially happened is I discovered a connection between the yarn and the AstroTurf, so it sticks onto it. So while I'm working, I can remove it and add it very easily, and it really takes away the preciousness while in the studio. And I also found that it acts as a painted or drawn line once I applied it to the turf. So the simple act of sticking is really makes it not precious, but I do go back in at the end and I glue it initially, and then I do a ton of hand sewing, either an entire line or the ends of the line. So there's a lot of end hand work that goes into it. So this was an install shot that I had of my first show showing AstroTurf in 2017 in Houston, Texas. I had worked with a lot of materials up until this point, really searching for the right material to get across what I wanted formally. And so what I found throughout the years is the square and the rectangle were very rigid, and I didn't feel like the work could really be and feel alive. And so I wanted to explore shape and boundaries that also felt more in line with landscape, that were more organic, and also where I feel like with this art you can move on and off more easily with your eyes, and it doesn't kind of keep you stuck into a certain shape. The scale of my work is oftentimes within my arm span, so there's a definite body relationship. And I also find that the size lends itself to the feeling as if you could walk into it, which is definitely what I want in terms of landscape and how we feel within these specific places. So one thing that I'm doing is really thinking about capturing the vastness of the ground. And so oftentimes I'll really focus in on details. And the small details are meant to be kind of the main focus in a lot of the works and a lot of these like subtle plays. And when you're out in some of these landscapes that I referenced, and at this point from memory, because I do live in Los Angeles, but it was really formative for me growing up in these specific places. And I think it created that foundation for how I see. And so when you're out walking in these places, you really zoom in on the details because you are in these very big spaces. And so details become alive and you really start to notice colors and shapes. I do have my own set of limitations. So I'm always trying to explore with some of these artificial materials, where can the artist's hand come in? Because I'm using this rigid line of this yarn. So is it in a small little detail where the line comes out of the shape, or where it feels not super straight, but it's a little off-centered? So is that where my hand can come in while I'm using some of these materials? Just wanted to add more detail shots. My process is very intuitive while in the studio. That's not to say it's not without starting places. So a lot of times it's a series of reactions to the last mark, the last material, the last color. And I do work on numerous pieces at once, 3 or 4 times, going back and forth between them. Another detail shot, you'll see, of course, the work downstairs. It won't be these pieces, but you'll get a better sense of the materiality and playing with thickness of yarns and different sort of softness or ways to kind of soften that harshness of the artificial turf. In 2019, this was an exhibition in Oakland at Interface Gallery, and this was a show where I really began to bring in more culturally significant materials. So, for instance, I brought in willow here, and let me show you a detail. A little hard to see, but I have willow there, as well as sinew. That one is buffalo sinew, and so for anyone not familiar, sinew is a connective tissue, like a tendon, ligament. And traditionally we used it, my tribes, as thread. That was one of the uses anyway, was for thread, for moccasin making or anything like that. So I also, started bringing in buffalo hide, which is the brown section that you can see there. I closed out the shape with a piece of willow. So really just kind of playing formally with shape, with textures. And I also found that this material grounded the artifice. It grounded it, of course, in like a very personal way, and then also formally through bringing in the natural materials. I'll show you some more install shots of that show. And a lot of times a shape is sort of influenced from a previous shape. So really kind of, I had this kind of triangular shape and I wanted something tall and skinny. So it kind of becomes this kind of intuitive response to the last piece. This is a show from DeBoer Gallery in LA called Pulling Up the Prairie. And again, a continuation of adding on the natural materials. One thing I won't talk about because we do have a short time is the baskets. But the baskets are a part of my practice where I think that I'm really exploring the relationship between them and the wall pieces. And they inform the wall pieces and the wall pieces inform them. The materials all kind of come together in that way. When I moved to Los Angeles, I began to work outside, and I also began to grow a Hidatsa garden every summer. So the piece here on the right, mapping out the land, I added in some dried corn husks to that piece there. And I really love exploring the fragility in work as well, which I think definitely gets to also life and kind of exploring that connection piece with the artificial turf. The piece on the right is titled Good Weather, and I wanted to show you a detail of the solder. So I was soldering directly into the AstroTurf there. And my work, for me, always goes back to abstraction in the end. So the mark making is not meant to sort of directly symbolize something or represent something, but instead I really want to make sure that the work gets to become its own kind of autonomous object in a way, or sort of, there's always associations, of course, but I think the beauty of abstraction is that it also gets to live outside of these certain confines and boundaries. And that's one thing that really draws me to that. So some bark here that's sewn onto the yarn for a detail shot on that. I use a lot of spray paint. I've now started incorporating acrylic onto the work. So figuring out ways to also change the ground of the AstroTurf because there are limitations. It's not like canvas in that way, but learning ways to also change the color of that and alter it. One thing in my work is it does have a lot of personal references, even with materiality and sort of memory. But as I mentioned, it all goes back to being that kind of abstraction in the end. Just wanted to show some more quick details. And so this is a piece of parfleche, a piece of hide that's sewn onto the work there. And one way that I finish my work is, as I mentioned, kind of not being able to place it, not being able to give it a direct location or rather identification. And so for me, that is when a work is finished and it gets to have a life of its own. And I will pass it on to Mark. Thank you so much.
Hi, everybody. Thank you all for being here. I have to say first that I'm extremely giddy, honored, and a little nervous to be sharing the stage with such great artists and the galleries downstairs with such great artists. So, yeah, that's how I'm going to start. I've been my artist statement. The statement that Joanne read starts off with a sentence that I'm a father, I'm a husband, I'm an artist, I'm an educator. My life is those four things, and I think it's really impossible to separate those. Those are all interwoven with each other. I've been teaching now for like 20 years, and you guys are gonna have to forgive me a little bit here because I'm gonna give my students a test that are in the audience here. I've been joking for a long time that I'm writing a book about all the fantastic, and they are fantastic, little nuggets of knowledge that I tend to scream them at my students, and also those fantastic dad jokes that I give. So, I don't have the book done yet, but this is the new cover for the book that I am working on writing right now. Markisms, right? So I guess what I wanted to say next is I like to yell at my students that sculpture is a, say it louder?
Team sport.
Sculpture is a team sport. I couldn't do what happened downstairs without support from a lot of different people, right? And so Teresa did a great job of reading or naming all the people she wanted to thank. I would forget and I'd get all rattled and I wouldn't name them all, so I wanted to type them out. And I know I've missed some folks, but all of these people were pretty integral in me getting the piece done downstairs. So thank you for that. Okay, I feel like my work, every piece leads to the next piece. So I'm gonna go back a little ways and gonna talk through my work. I grew up, and it's funny, I think landscape is so important to what I do, and I think that's, I really resonated with what Teresa was saying. I grew up in Joplin, Missouri, or outside of Joplin, Missouri. Joplin, Missouri is a historic mining area. It's a boom area, right? So especially like during between the wars, in the middle of the two world wars, Joplin was the leading lead and zinc mining area in the world, right? And so what was needed was taken out of the ground and it was just left there, right? And so I grew up surrounded by these things. If you squint your eyes and look at them, you think that's really awful, right? The land has just been obliterated and then just left. I mean, these are photographs that I've collected over the years. A little map of where the mining happened. Even down here in this area around Pitcher, Oklahoma, that's a Superfund site, right? So it's a site that people have been made to leave, right? So there's a certain, I think, horror to looking at some of these landscapes. But to me, growing up with these things in my backyard, these were the most magical places in the world, right? And so these were my playgrounds. These are the places, the landscapes that shaped a lot of what I see. And so I've spent a lot of time in my adult life in making art, thinking about where I've come from. And I'm going to go back to these pieces where I use oftentimes kind of the metaphor of roots and trees, thinking about connecting to a place, right? But also to kind of a past and looking for a connection or searching for a connection. These two pieces, it was a kind of a fun couple of shows that I was curated into. One was at at Rockhurst University, and the other one was at the Jewish Contemporary Art Museum, Museum Without Walls here in over here somewhere in Overland Park. The theme of these shows were they connected the artists to different collections of art. One was Christian art, one was Judaica, and asked us to respond to those works. And for me, these were really important pieces in that I was allowed to kind of go back and connect to my own, not just physical past, but more of a spiritual past, and trying to connect myself to where I am and who I am now. But yeah, the one between thee and we was inspired by a yod, a Torah pointer, and the other one was inspired, kind of, if you look at the negative space here, this was inspired by a Madonna figure. And so I was trying to placing myself into those histories. I've played a lot with roots and connections. It was 2012, actually, that I had an opportunity to go do a visiting artist residency at the University of Hawaii. I was brought in to help co-teach a class or work with a class. It was an installation and performance art class, and I was brought in to do the installation component. And so I worked with students. This was a great experience for me because I came in with this idea of roots, and we gave the students a kind of a parallel project to my project, where they were all given like a chunk of a root, right? And they were supposed to do performances with these works. And so as I'm working on this installation, they're working with me on their ideas, and they actually did performances in the piece. And so this was called Searching for a Toehold. The student population was incredibly diverse at the University of Hawaii, so it was a fun experience just to kind of connect two pasts, two histories. And I did this. I built this installation in just a couple of weeks. And and 2x4s has been a material I've used for a long time. I love the idea of kind of cheap materials that you can then elevate to another level. So these were all just purchased on site at the Home Depot. And then this was the series of performances that were happening with those students. And so it was a fantastic experience about not just me connecting to my own past, but allowing and connecting to other pasts and allowing students to do that as well. Back to I've been collecting a lot of these images of these old, it was just kind of funny that people would buy a postcard of this level of smoke, and it's funny to me. But I see beauty in this, beauty where beauty is not really meant to be. Maybe it's because I'm getting older now. I'm kind of looking back and kind of looking for my place in art as well. I'm not saying I'm in this category necessarily, but I'm really interested in the fact that I'm looking backwards and I'm seeing other artists that have in the past that are connected to the same things I've been connected to. They're inspired by the same things I've been connected to. And there is actually some really interesting research out right now. I'm sure maybe some of you have seen this about how some of these artists working at this time were actually looking through the smog and the pollution of the Industrial Revolution. And so they're reacting to the same things I feel like I'm reacting to in a lot of ways. And so it's to me, it's an interesting connection. My work is observational. I look at what's around me and I react to it. And so I started, this is on the Evergy power plant. I'm going south to visit my parents. I would go by this all the time. This was actually taken from a speeding car. Deepwater Horizon oil spill. I mean, I look at these things, and I don't know if you've ever stopped and stared at like a power plant, especially during the wintertime, the steam is boiling out. those things are just magical. I kind of get a little caught up in that smoke and the steam, and there's something beautiful. But then you also understand what the connection is, or what maybe is not beautiful about that. Same with the Deepwater Horizon explosion that happened in 2010. I collect these images. These images mean a lot to me. So those images start ending up in my work, right? And so I was going through a period where I was actually playing with still that connection to the past, connection to the planet, connection to, but also thinking about the consumption. And this is a kind of important time for me because I really always wanted to acknowledge that I am part of what I'm kind of talking about. I consume, I use, and even the kind of some of the processes and techniques I use are part of that. So there became this literal connection to not just what I'm consuming, but then what happens after it's consumed, right? Then I started going through a progression where I tried to maybe make the work a little less didactic, I guess. Maybe trying to pull the forms out that I love the most and kind of focus on those. And this is maybe my move toward abstraction in a way where I'm isolating that form and separating it from a context. Focusing on the beauty of the form that I see. This is also one of the first times I actually integrated lights into the work, and so that's something I've kind of hung on to for a while. I'm in love with the mechanisms, letting you see kind of those connections to the past. My work is often about those connections, and so I want to make the connections evident. I'll say connections again. This is a piece that I did around 2019, I suppose. This is actually over in FADS when we opened it up a few years ago. And then again, this is me playing with that form and removing it from context, but then kind of playing with this mechanical connections and structure. And I'm in love with those connections again. And then I wanted to incorporate the lights. When I first started putting lights on these, they were just the white lights, and they just were wrong. They were just wrong. And as a sculptor, I've always been a little bit scared of color, right? So I kind of let materials be what materials are. Color it has been secondary. So then I don't know if I'm going to say this too loudly, but I think I didn't know what I was going to do, and I was driving home one night and driving into the sunset, and the answer was right there. And so I just started buying the tubes and playing with color as I went. Some of my favorite views of this work are these parts down here, like these wires, these connections. You can see how my hand's shaking. This is the part I want people to see. This is the part I want. I do acknowledge the fact that I'm part of what I'm criticizing, and often, and I think that those connections are really important to me of drawing. In fact, the show that I had here called The Space Between, that's what it was about. It was about this, and then there's like this connection between the two realms that I think are really important. Images, connections, looking to what's around me, more of the Joplin mining scenes, sunset, just some odd structures that exist out there. There's a certain beauty to that. And I have a bunch of these stories collected over the years about, I don't even know if they're true or not, and I don't care. I want to hang on to the myth, right? But there was a story about, I believe it was Duchamp and Brancusi and somebody else famous that probably really didn't happen, that had gone to a trade show, a trade fair, and they were confronted with a big propeller that was all made out of laminated plywood, and it was carved, and it was like this gorgeous structure, and one of them had stated that I need to stop making work because I can't make anything better than that. And I think to me that idea of capturing or understanding beauty that wasn't meant to be beautiful is something that I pay attention to a lot. Case in point, I'm very inspired by the photographs of Bernd and Hilla Becker. Bernd and Hilla Becker were a German duo who went around taking photographs of objects that weren't designed to be beautiful objects and saying, look how beautiful this object is. Right, so yeah, that's to me, in a way, it gives me license to do what I want to do in terms of just kind of letting objects be what they are. And then 2000, I don't even know the year. I was commissioned to do this work for the Salina Art Center, and they had seen some of the cloud work I'd done before. I had a show inspired by clouds, and so I wanted to build works that were integrated into structure, and the scaffolding entered the work then, and I built the works and clouds on and around the scaffolding. I'm really interested in finding a connection between the viewer and the clouds that I'm playing with. I love the idea that these are just sort of drifting in the gallery, but they're also tethered and connected to what sustains them in that way. Again, my favorite details are those of underneath, of that sort of that literal physical tether connection between our space and what sustains us. The word drift, I keep hanging on to. I love this idea of the fact that we're still moving forward. We're still consuming. We're lost in some ways, and maybe I should say I and not we. But these pieces are the ones that led to the exhibition downstairs. Joanne had seen these and invited me to actually she invited me to show these. Can I say this? I said no, I didn't want to show these. And I asked if I could build something bigger, because I felt like these might get lost in the gallery, and I wanted to do something that kind of filled the space and really placed the viewer in the exhibition. I don't have any good shots of the show downstairs. You can guys go experience that for yourselves. This is a shot that you can't actually see. This is one of my favorite places to view the work, which is actually from the inside. David, we might get you up there soon and let you see it. Anyway, that's all I have. Thank you so much. Yeah.
Hello, everyone. How are you? I'm Rashawn. If I don't know you, it's very nice to meet you. And if I do know you, thank you for coming out. I appreciate it. I am going to talk about the work that's downstairs right now. These are pictures I took with my phone, and they'll be a little bit weird, but I think it's going to be fine. We're going to enjoy it. We're going to kind of go through. I think it'll work out. I think in order to talk about my work, I kind of have to give you a little bit of a history of what it is I do. I make work about the material world, the world of stuff, the world of objects and its interaction with the world of painting, such as, these are stretched canvases made out of scarves and materials I had and things that existed. And this is an installation of it up at the Whitney Museum. And this was an exhibition I had, I think this last year at the Momentary down in Bentonville, Arkansas. When I make work, I'm really interested in the material world due to the fact that things have a certain resonance. There's like a history of materials and ideas and this kind of psychological resonance. And I sort of like the material world and what happens once you introduce that into the world of painting, into the world of abstraction like everybody else. I think anytime you talk about abstraction, you're talking about, or there is a certain subjectivity that comes with looking at something abstract. You may see shapes and colors, I may know what the thing is coming from, but somebody else may see something entirely different. And that's really exciting for me. And I think it's sort of, it puts a lot of trust in the viewer too. When they come into an object, they have to look and come up with their own imagination. And that sort of interplay between those things is always something that I find kind of thrilling because it leads you someplace new. I also, specifically, I was kind of interested in early West Coast assemblage. I think I had a show with I've done some work both, when I talk about early West Coast assemblage, I mean like Singing Ngudi, David Hammond's, people working out there in the early 90s and its relationship to sculpture, stuff in the world and the social history and its relationship to painting, not sculpture. But the way I make work is sort of a generational abstraction. I think I can visually show you what that is. I'm gonna try to. When I say generational abstraction, I mean I will start with something like maybe this, like a drawing of something that's very deliberate, something that's out there. This is a pastoral landscape. And then when I redraw that, it may become something like this still life here, which is a bit more abstract. The paint kind of speaks for itself. It becomes something in, and it may end up looking a little bit more like this, which is an oil painting with some other materials kind of mixed into itself. And then, maybe a final stage, it may end up like this. So you may not even see the history of the thing, where the thing comes from. It's sort of like you see the colors and the shapes and the forms, but you also see the stuff in there. Like rather than just using paint, I'm using objects I found and things that are around in there. And so that it all kind of operates as a painting together. Does that make sense a little bit? You guys are following me? And so my hope is too, is that when you go downstairs, you'll kind of view this also as a painting. It's a painting that's a sculpture. It's a sculpture you can walk into, but it's a square. It's a thing that's in there. It kind of exists. I build them like a paintings. They kind of exist. And the work, it's going well. Things are happening. This is the piece I was working on that's downstairs right now. I began working on it almost about a year ago, exactly. I refer to it as the changing room, specifically because there are 3 mirrors in there. When you go into there, it's like a changing room, You'll have 3 mirrors that kind of look at you. There's this implication of the body that's kind of in there. But as I was making this work or finishing this work, I broke my leg. And when I say I broke my leg, I had a tibial plateau fracture, which means like a chunk of my bone came off and they had to plate and pin it back together so my leg wasn't crooked for the whole time. I don't know why you're laughing. It was really bad. The surgery was kind of pretty intense. They just have to rip you open and put yourself back together. But because of this, number one, I had to have a lot of friends help me with my work, but I was also trapped in bed for about a month. You can't really walk on top of the bone, because if you walk on top of the bone, that could break again, and then you could have a crooked leg for the rest of your life. And so I was trying to make work because I had a lot of things happening, and I was trying to think about what I could do while I was essentially just bedridden. And I was working with this small little gesture, and I had a little bit of erasable, kneadable erasable with me. And I was doing this thing where I was just making little balls of things with my hand, like little balls of clay. Kind of like the way you make bread balls when you're a little kid. That's what I used to do. You get bread and you make little balls out of it. And it just occurred to me that once you do that over and over, it kind of builds up and accumulates, and then you have this field of painting, this field of mark that becomes this leftover thing of the body, of where the body used to be there. But there's no body there. It's just sort of the gesture. It's kind of like a Jackson Pollock, if you imagine him shirtless and throwing paint around. It's like that, but just little tiny balls of clay. Just kind of doing that. And so, once again, when I talk about generational abstraction, I'm also talking about my working process, how it is I think, how it is I make things. And so the next step for me in this process, if it's a ball, I want to make a ball of a ball. And so that's me doing my Louis Bourgeois impression with my balls of balls there. So the field turns into a ball. And then I think to myself, what forms would these balls sit in if they were to sit in a ball? And that's kind of where things became really fun. I got to kind of experiment with those ideas of what this form would look like, where these things would exist, and how these things kind of exist in the world. Because I also, once again, it's like an abstraction, like this generational abstraction. One idea kind of leads to the next and kind of leads into another form. And so a lot of these forms were kind of coming out of this hypothesis I was sort of posing to myself, what happens if these things existed in the world? Where were they going? What would they do? And so that's kind of what was leading me to these forms that were down there. Here's another one there. The other thing that happened to me at this time was, and this is what I noticed here, is that I have vitiligo. And the way vitiligo works is my white blood cells essentially create antigens for the melatonin in my skin. And so, for example, when I broke my leg, the first thing that happened is my entire leg went white, because all the white blood cells are going down there to fix everything, to heal everything, right? And so there's this whole internal process that's happening inside my body that I don't really know about, but it also creates this kind of dislocation I have with my body, with looking at it, with seeing it, and understanding where it comes from. I think a title of the show that they said at the Momentary was, we no longer recognize the backs of our hands, because I don't really recognize the backs of my hand. It's always changing. It's always constantly in flux a little bit. And I really was thinking about these sculptures as surrogates for bodies. And if this is the body, then I'm kind of giving the sculpture an outfit, kind of dressing it up. So it's both a painting, but also it's a body, but also it's kind of an outfit too at the same time. And if this is thinking about it, if this is the outside of the body, then at some point, I guess I'm going to have to make the inside of the body. And so this is kind of where these forms and this idea was sort of coming from. It also kind of reminded me of the bed I was stuck in for a month, or it's just kind of in there. And so you have this kind of contained interior space with these forms that are kind of related to this process, and the process It's kind of related to my experience within there, and the whole thing kind of operates as this physical thing. I think in my previous work, there was always this implication of the body, like in the changing room, especially with fabric and clothes and things in the world. It's sort of like suggesting a body, but there was really nothing that was sort of representative of one. And so, in a way, I was really kind of excited about the idea of making something that sort of physically could take place in there, or what I was imagining was happening inside the body. I mean, there's a lot of things going on that I don't understand, and I think they have this. For me, it's this interesting kind of psychological weight that I think kind of plays back into the subjectivity or the idea of subjectivity that happens in abstraction, that happens in painting. You know, when you're sort of looking at a thing and trying to think it through. What was the artist thinking? Where were they coming from? And that kind of narrative is kind of where a lot of these ideas and these forms, specifically in this body of work, are coming from. And I think these slides are a little bit out of order, which is kind of a bummer more than anything else, because I sped up a little bit to end the talk, but this is kind of where the talk was beginning at some point. So that's another show. Just to give you an example of what previous shows of mine look like. I think the really exciting part of this is like the first time I'm not putting anything on a wall. Like everything's kind of in this space. Everything is sort of physically there. But at the same time, I'm building my own walls, and I'm building my own spaces, and their own spaces that things are hanging on, things are above you, things are below you. There's a really interesting German word I can't pronounce. Can you pronounce the Gesamtkunstwerk? There you go. Thanks, David. Say it again. Yeah, this means total work of art. It means like it's an immersive experience. And so a lot of times I'm like, what would it be like to be inside of a painting? And for me, that inside experience, what's happening internally in your head, it's very different than what's happening externally. And so I wanted this difference between what's happening inside the space, but also kind of outside the space too. And so I'm really kind of making these experiences for you to have, or the viewer to have, as they're kind of going through it. And I think I'm just gonna end it right there, if that's okay. Go forward.